Hello, everybody. I want to welcome everybody here tonight. Glad we're all excited about what we get to hear about. I wanted to thank the leadership team for the Ecological Sciences and Engineering Interdisciplinary Graduate Program that put this together as part of their symposium. So they did an amazing job, and I just really want to thank them. So I don't know where they all are, but if they could stand up. Patricia and Liz and Jake. Jake's backstage, and one of the leadership team had to sacrifice today because I'm actually the PI of a grant, and she had to go to Pakistan at the last minute. So we want to thank Becca Nixon as well. And then we couldn't have done this without help from the Purdue Climate Change Center, the Center for the Environment, and the Sesquicentennial Celebration Committee, specifically the sustainability group within that committee. And then we had Environmental Ecological Engineering help support the event, the Office of Interdisciplinary Graduate Programs. We had the College of Agriculture, specifically the Agricultural Research and Education Dean supported the event. We had several smaller donations from departments across the whole campus. So it really was an event that was supported by this whole campus, multiple colleges, multiple departments. And then to introduce our speaker, I'm going to introduce Dr. Bernal. She is a professor in biology and a long-term friend of Dr. Hayhoe, and she's going to come forward and introduce Katharine.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you to the organizers for giving me the honor to introduce my colleague and longtime friend, Katharine Hayhoe. I'm a little emotional. Wow. We've been longtime friends, and she's been an inspiration. Okay, so Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, she's an atmospheric scientist, as you know, and you're here for a real deal. This is a treat. And she got her bachelor's in physics and astronomy from the University of Toronto. And then she switched gears, and she went to the Midwest, not so far from here, to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she did her master's and her PhD in atmospheric science. She's now a professor at the Department of Political Sciences and director of the Climate Change Center at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. And you feel free to Google where Lubbock is. Not many people know. She's also the founder and the CEO of the Atmos Research, which bridges the gap between scientists and stakeholders to provide simple, digestible, and state-of-the-art information about climate change. And I could spend a whole hour telling you all her accomplishments, but I'm going to focus on a few. She has published more than 120 peer-reviewed publications. She has an amazing book entitled A Climate for Change, Global Warming Facts for Faith-Based Decisions, which she wrote together with her husband, Andrew Farley. And she has so many awards that I decided I'm going to force myself to pick my top three favorites. So here you go. 2012, she was selected by Christianities Today as the 50 women to watch. Keep an eye on her. To decide what that means. 2014, she was Time's 100 Most Influential People, and 2017, Fortune's World's Greatest Leaders. And I know I'll reach three, but she was also a contributor that participated in the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I could keep going on and on about her accomplishments, but I want to highlight today how she's also an outstanding mom and an amazing friend. With that, welcome.
Thank you so much. And this fell off immediately. Let's just leave that off, shall we? Okay. It is great to be with you here today. I'm glad everybody fit in. And we're going to talk about something which we often feel is a phenomena that is very much a new or emerging phenomena that we've just started to see in recent years. You're going to be part of this discussion. So what I want you to do is I actually do want you to take out your phone. If you have a laptop, you could take it out too. Take out your phone and go to polev.com/TexasTech. It'll ask you for a name, but you don't have to enter a name. I don't collect the names, so you can just keep it anonymous. So go to pollev.com/Texas Tech, and then go ahead and take our first poll. Are you A, undergraduate student, B, graduate student, C, community member, or D, faculty or staff? And you know what? It's not showing up here. So just a second here. We have this little problem. Let's try this. Play from start. Nope. It gets a little funny with the presenter view and the projectors. Is it showing up now? Dang it. I get to see the data, and you don't. Oh, we just saw it. Okay, let's try this again. Okay. So if I just left it, the data showed up? If I, oh, there we go. Okay, now we're good. All right. Okay, so 37% undergraduate, 28% graduate, and you can see it moving as people respond. 17% community, and 18% faculty and staff. That's a great ratio. All right, so now you know how to use the app. That's all it takes. So as Calvin says, we live in interesting times. We don't trust the government, we don't trust the legal system, we don't trust the media, and we don't trust each other. We have undermined all authority, and with it, the basis for replacing it. It's like a 6-year-old's dream come true. We see books like The War on Science or Denialism, How Irrational Thinking Hinders Scientific Progress. But did you know that the definitive work on this, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, it was published in the 1960s. So this whole idea of a fact-free world is not actually very new. In fact, in 1954, Stevenson said, "Unreason and anti-intellectualism abominate thought, because thinking implies disagreement, disagreement implies nonconformity, nonconformity implies heresy, and heresy implies disloyalty. So obviously thinking must be stopped." Look at the date here, 1954. But shouting is not a substitute for thinking, and reason is not a subversion, but rather the salvation of freedom. Doesn't this almost seem like a prophecy? Then in 1980, Asimov, who was a science fiction writer, said in 1980, there's a cult of ignorance in the United States, and there always has been. It is a constant thread winding through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. And then in 87, Wolf said, this is the new illiteracy. It's the literacy of those who can read but don't. It is more pernicious than the old because, unlike the old, it does not debar its victims from power and influence. Although, like the old one, it does disqualify them from it. We are not dealing with a new problem. We have confronted these issues for decades. They have, as Asimov said, been constant threads running through the culture and the society of the United States. But there is a new aspect to them today. And this new aspect is best encapsulated by this perspective on the political spectrum in the United States. So you can see we're stepping through time. We started in 1950, now we're up to 1994. In 1994, this is what the political landscape looked like in the United States. You have conservatives and you have liberals, and they were nice, normal distributions with most people in the middle and the averages close together. Since then, what has happened? As we step through time, these two distributions have moved further apart and they have become much more skewed. When you look at only people who voted in the 2016 election, it looks even worse. So not only do we have this thread of anti-intellectualism running through our society, but today it has fallen straight into the giant gap of political polarization. So that is why today is more severe than we've seen in previous times. So now when we have tough conversations, Susie the scientist and Calvin are disagreeing about something. So what does Susie the scientist do? She shows up with all her data and her facts and her information and her scientific publications. And what does Calvin respond with? Calvin responds with a comment like this. That type of arrogance is exactly what I'd expect from somebody who's trying so desperately to defend their climate change religion. But alas, I will try to educate you. Now, this is a real comment that I got from someone. Do you know who wrote this? One of our undergraduate students at Texas Tech, to a professor. These conversations on tough issues, they don't build bridges, they dig trenches. And they often end something like this. Or perhaps like this. Now, this isn't unique to climate change. There are all kinds of issues that are falling into this political polarization gap. So I want to ask you, you tell me, what issue, what topic is so politically polarized we can hardly have a good conversation about it anymore? And if you're using more than one word, please join them with a dash. Otherwise, they'll show up as separate words. So climate dash change. But not climate, there's a whole ton of them. Give me some more of them. Yes, we got two good ones right there. Vaccines, yes. Transportation, religion, mental health, evolution, abortion, GMOs, gay marriage, climate change, women's rights, inequity. See, look at this. These are, yeah. Immigration, yep, that's a big one too. Gun control, I didn't even see that before, yes. Look at the issues that we cannot have civil conversations anymore. Look at the issues that a conversation typically ends something like this, or this again. So what does this have to do with climate change? Everything. Back in 2014, so 5 years ago, a nationwide study asked people what they thought of various issues, and then they ranked the issues by which issues Democrats and Republicans most disagreed on. So the issue that people most disagreed on in 2014, depending on whether they're Democrat or Republican, is, to be honest, the issue they should most disagree on, which is, do you approve of the president, right? Because, I mean, why else are you Democrat or Republican? So the number one issue was, do you approve of the president? And that was where the biggest gap was. And again, this is 5 years ago. It's not today. You know what the second issue was? Climate change. Climate change beat out gun control and abortion. And what's really scary is actually not number 2, but number 4. I mean, how about, do you trust accountants? Or do you trust teachers? Or do you trust, well, do you trust lawyers? That might actually be at the bottom of the list. Sorry, just a joke. But it isn't just about climate change. This is some data from Larry Hamilton, who surveys public opinion on a lot of different things. These are all different topics, and he breaks it out by how people self-identify politically: liberal, moderate, conservative, conservative. Do you trust scientists for information about vaccines, about nuclear power, about GMOs, about evolution, about climate change? Some of them, there's a steeper gradient than others, but each one of these shows a political gradient. We hear people, every time we turn on the TV, we go to our favorite news program, we hear politicians and pundits saying things like, for everyone who thinks it's warming, I can find someone who says it isn't. Or, from Texas, alarmist theories on climate science originate with scientists who operate outside the principles of the scientific method. Or, to be fair, from Indiana, climate change is leftist propaganda aimed at changing the way Americans live and creating more government obstruction and intrusion in our lives. Politicians bring snowballs onto the Senate floor to say that global warming can't be real. When it's cold outside, they say, oh, so much for global warming. And when I get attacked, which I do multiple times every day now on a regular basis, I look at every single person who, some of them write letters, real letters. Some of them phone. Some of them often attack on social media because that's the easiest. And so I went through the bios of the 6 most recent people who had bios who attacked me on Twitter. This is just the last 2 days. And I just snapshotted the bios for you. What do these bios have in common? Power with the people and not elitists that infest the government. MAGA. MAGA conservative. The UN's climate models have been consistently wrong. Okay. I love this great country, corrupt government, libertarian, less government. there is a direct relationship between people's political perspectives and the fact that they think it's okay to say really hateful things to a woman they've never met before on social media because she says climate change is real. What type of things do we hear people say? We hear them say things like, this is the most frequent one, it's just a natural cycle. Or, we haven't studied this long enough to be sure. Or, you scientists are just making this whole thing up to line your pockets. Sea levels lie. Yeah, I've actually heard that. Sea levels lie. They're falling, they're not rising. Or, it's such a tiny amount of CO2 you're talking about. Well, it's such a tiny amount of white powder I put in your cup. Surely you're okay with that. And of course, between the months of November and May, the number one thing we hear is it's cold outside. So where's global warming now? So let me ask you, what sciencey sounding objections have you heard? What do you hear when people say, and you can type in entire sentences here. It doesn't have to be a single word. You don't have to use dashes. You can type in an entire sentence. What sciencey sounding objections have you heard? Because I bet you've heard some. Okay, it's been warmer before. Yep, natural cycle. It's been warmer before. That is probably the number one thing that we hear the most. Correlation is not causation, exactly. There's an excellent, there was, up to recently, a really good causation between number of pirates and global temperature. There's also a correlation between Nicolas Cage movies and something else. You can Google that. It's happening, but we can't prove it's us. The glaciers are growing. It's a hoax. It costs too much to fix. It's your fault. Yep. It's the sun. Yep, that's another one that we hear a lot. It's all made up. It's volcanoes is something else that we hear. So we hear these objections all the time, and often we think to ourselves, if they just knew the facts, they'd change their mind, right? But here's the thing. Our brains are not blank slates when it comes to climate change. You would have had to be living under a rock the last 10 years not to have heard about climate change or global warming. So often we think, especially as educators, we think, well, if we just write the correct information on people's mental slates, then surely they'll agree, right? And this is why I love the social science, because the social science actually can test questions like this. So back in 2012, so 7 years ago now, Dan Kahan from Yale did a seminal study where he said, we know that public apathy on climate change is often attributed to a deficit in comprehension. People don't know enough science to understand or to avoid being misled. We conducted a study to test for this, and we found no support. In fact, people with the highest degree of science literacy were not most concerned about climate change. They were what? Most polarized on climate change. Larry Hamilton at the University of New Hampshire did some research where he asked people, do you agree that climate change is happening now caused mainly by human activities? And then he asked, what's your level of education? So people started off, and then they asked, would you call yourself a Democrat or Republican, or would you say that you were Tea Party? He did this a couple of years ago. So as people get more education, what happens? We split. And then Dan Kahan did further research looking around the entire United States, and he used a metric called science intelligence. So in other words, how good you are at quantitative reasoning related to science. And that's just one measure of many different types of intelligence. But he was saying, well, maybe understanding climate change requires science intelligence, he said. So he looked at the correlation between ordinary science intelligence and the probability of the correct response to the question above, which is yes, agree. There's a very weak correlation between science intelligence and ability to agree. And then you know what he did? He took this exact data set and he separated it out. And you know how he separated it out? You can probably have a guess, right? We are not blank slates when it comes to climate change. We all have a lot of information written on our slate. So when we look at this, as scientists who operate on a facts-based communication principle, as educators who are about teaching people information, when we look at this, often our reaction is kind of a bit like this. What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to have constructive conversations? How are we supposed to move this issue forward when we can't even agree about what a thermometer says? I've got 3 steps to how to move this forward. And the first step is this: don't fall for the smoke screens. What are the smoke screens? The smoke screens are the objections that we throw up to hide the real objections we have. And what are the objections that we often throw up? And when people throw these up and when we engage with them, we're kind of like, when we engage with these smoke screens, we're kind of like Don Quixote tilting with windmills. Do you remember the story of Don Quixote? He was a knight in medieval Spain, and he would go around on his horse, and when he saw a windmill, he would attack the windmill because he thought it was his enemy. So when we engage with the smoke screens, we're tilting at windmills instead of tilting at the real issue. So one of the smoke screens is sciencey sounding objections. Like what? Like you just listed. Sciencey sounding objections are largely a smoke screen. Why? Because we've known about this thing for a very long time. We have known that our planet has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases that keeps it over 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it would be otherwise since the work of Joseph Fourier in the 1820s. We have known which gases make up this natural blanket: water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, and a few more. We have known about these gases since the work of Tyndall in the 1850s, and Tyndall didn't stop there. He directly linked increasing levels of these gases with fossil fuel extraction and combustion. In the 1850s, he noted that coal mining releases methane that is trapped within the layers of coal into the atmosphere, where it wraps an extra blanket around the planet that we do not need. And what does an extra blanket do? It traps more heat. Then, on the opposite side of the ocean, also in the 1850s, there was a woman called Eunice Foote. Eunice was an amateur scientist. Tyndall was a professional. He was trained in all the latest schools at the time. Eunice was an amateur who did experiments in her backyard. And she did an experiment that she wrote up and that was presented on her behalf at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which still continues today. Her work was presented in 1856. She filled up different jars and put them out in the sun and measured how the temperature changed depending on which gas she put in the jar. 1856. Now, the results she got showed that carbon dioxide had heat-trapping potential. Now, she didn't differentiate between visible versus infrared radiation like Tyndall did because she wasn't a professional scientist at that day. But in that paper in 1856, she actually concluded that if carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere of our planet were higher, our temperature would be higher. 1856. Then by the 1890s, Arrhenius, a Swedish chemist, in between doing the work that won him a Nobel Prize for physical chemistry, he had to keep himself entertained on the weekends. So he decided, using nothing more than the physics they knew in 1890, I'm going to calculate the first climate model by hand. I'm going to calculate how much the world would warm if we doubled or tripled levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which he knew was already going to occur as a result of the extraction and combustion of coal and then eventually gas and oil. He thought it would take 1,000 years or more, though. He didn't realize that we have been pulling the stuff out and burning it exponentially. But the numbers he calculated for how much our planet would warm and how much faster the Arctic would warm than the rest of the Earth are very similar to what our most powerful supercomputers and most complex climate models calculate today in 1890. After 2 years of doing this on the weekend, his wife left him. I take this very personally because I do climate modeling too, but I set up the runs and then I go and I have dinner with my family and then I check the runs at night. It's worked out so far. Then, by 1938, Guy Callendar, who was a British engineer who also was looking for some entertainment on the weekends, wrote around the world and collected weather station data from around the world and calculated the first global average temperature. And in his paper published in 1937, Well, it was submitted in 37. It was published in 1938. Submission and publication dates have not changed much in 100 years. He concluded, and he actually says, you're not going to believe what I have to show you, but I will prove to you through analysis of data that the planet is warming due to human emissions of what he called carbonic acid, we call now carbon dioxide, in 1938. Now we know today that that is why the Earth is warming. So we've known for more than 100 years that digging up and burning coal and gas and oil releases heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere that are building up, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, and that is the reason why the planet is warming today when it should be cooling. Because since then, we've crossed a lot of T's and dotted a lot of I's. Like what? We've looked at whether it could be the sun. Turns out it couldn't because the sun's energy has been going down the last few decades. So according to the sun, we should be getting cooler right now, not warmer. Could it be natural cycles like El Nino? No, because all they do is move heat around the climate system. They can't create heat. That would violate conservation of energy. Could it be the changes in the Earth's orbit that caused the ice ages or the warm periods like we're in today? No, because warming after the last ice age peaked about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, and after that we were slowly cooling, ready to head into another glacial maximum until the last 300 years. We've crossed a few more T's and dotted a few more I's since then. 3 years ago, with a team of colleagues, we combed the scientific literature, and often in some very obscure journals, we managed to find 38 papers whose results said either climate isn't changing, or if it is, it isn't humans. These papers have been published in the last 10 years. We took every single one of those, and we, and by we I mostly mean our lead author, Erasmus Benestad, with some assistance from us, recalculated the results of every single one of these studies and made his code open source so anybody could go back and check what he did. And when that happened, what we found was every single study had at least one flaw, a false assumption, a faulty calculation, an inappropriate application of a certain statistic or technique, that if that flaw was corrected, it brought that paper in line with the rest of the scientific consensus of thousands of papers that have been published, showing that climate is changing and humans really are responsible today because according to volcanoes, natural cycles, orbital cycles, and the sun, we should be getting cooler right now, and we're not. The latest summary of what we know about what's happening to the planet was published a year ago last November. It is the first volume of the National Climate Assessment. It is online at science2017.globalchange.gov. And if you want to know more about the science, this is the definitive reference right now. But the bottom line is this. Our understanding that humans are affecting our planet is based on physics and chemistry we've known since the 1800s. The thermodynamics and the nonlinear fluid dynamics that are required to understand those simple truths are so basic that they are also what explain how fridges work, how stoves heat food, and how airplanes fly. So if we really want to throw out the science, if we genuinely think that the science that explains how climate is changing due to human activities is faulty, we also have to throw out almost every piece of modern technology that we use and say that it does not work. And most people haven't done that. There might be a website saying that airplanes don't really fly and it's actually a giant conspiracy. But that's not really a mainline view. We don't really have a problem with the actual science because it is very basic, it is very well understood, and we use that exact same science in our lives every day in other ways. So then you might say, oh, well, I know what the problem is. And in fact, Todd Rokita knows what the problem is. The problem is that the 97% of the liberal scientists who agree on this also believe there is no God. Scientists are like the rest of us. Humans can have beliefs, but that doesn't make it science. We're a little more concise in Texas. Climate change is not science, it's religion. So as much as I hear it's a natural cycle, I also hear bring on the end times, or we have dominion over the earth, so it doesn't matter what we do. Or how can you say there's global warming when it says there'll always be seasons in the Bible? God is in control, not humans. And of course, those scientists are all godless liberal atheists. So let me ask you in this room, Here's the thing. People say to me, and they've actually literally said this to me, they said, well, Katharine, you know, the solution to climate change is we have to get rid of religion. If we get rid of religion, all the stuff that people are believing, then we can fix climate change. And to that I say, first of all, A, good luck, and second of all, I'm not even with you there. Because that is not okay with me. Because if you look around the United States, over 80% of us belong to a faith tradition that is a really important part of our identity, our culture, and our heritage. So let me ask you here in this room, we're probably not quite a representative survey of the US, but let me ask you, do you consider yourself to be Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, humanist, atheist, agnostic, or other? And again, this is anonymous, so just answer whatever you feel. Nobody's watching. All right. So this is really interesting because I know the results are still coming in, but this is actually very typical of what we find in academic settings. One of my friends, Elaine Eklund, is a sociologist who studies scientists. I feel a little bit nervous around here sometimes because I feel a bit like a bug under a microscope. She studies scientists and she studies religion and spirituality. And in the first study that she did, which was prompted by a conversation she had in church. She goes to a Presbyterian church, and during the greeting time, when you stand up and you shake people's hands, the topic of science came up, and the woman in front of her said to Elaine, she said, well, you know those scientists, they're all atheists. And Elaine, being a sociologist, thought to herself, I wonder if they are. So she did a survey of scientists at R1 universities across the US, and what she found is that 70% of scientists at R1 universities would see themselves as having some type of spirituality. So they would not put themselves in the atheist category. And that really bucks a lot of what people think about religion and science. So these numbers that we're seeing here are actually very similar to what Elaine found surveying scientists at R1 University. So now let me ask you another question. Do you think that changing the category that you are in would fix climate change? Go ahead and answer. Yeah, yep, okay. All right, well, whoever you are, go ahead and change. Whoever are the 2 or the 3 people in category A, you go ahead and change, and then everybody else. See, I personally don't think it would help if everybody in this room changed, because if we get into the data, and I love looking at the data, this is a survey that was done a few years ago by the American Association of Religion, so all the theologians of the world and the religious scholars of the world. They surveyed the entire United States, and they said, how concerned are you about climate change? And then they separated this out by what? By denomination. So here's the really fascinating thing. They didn't only separate it out by denomination, they also separated out some of the categories by race. And what they found at the bottom, thank goodness, white Catholics actually beat out white evangelical Protestants for the lowest place. I say that, thank goodness, because I'm now second lowest category. It's good. But here's where the disconnect begins. Who is the most concerned people group about climate change? Hispanic Catholics. Don't they have the same Pope? And didn't that Pope write an encyclical that was all about climate change and how it disproportionately affects the poorest people on the planet, and he directly connected the dots between Christian values and caring about a changing climate? Well, in come the social scientists again, and this time it's my colleague Ashley, who's right at Texas Tech with us. Ashley did a study where she actually looked at the impact of the encyclical on people's opinion. And this is what she found. This is a quote from her abstract, but I will translate this into plain English. She found, so people were expecting the encyclical to change people's minds about climate change, right? What she found is that the encyclical changed people's minds about the Pope. Specifically, if Christians, and this applied to Protestants as well as Catholics, if Christians in general already pretty much agreed climate change is real, and then they read the Pope's encyclical or heard about it, it gave them a better opinion of the Pope. If they didn't already agree with the Pope, then the encyclical came out, their opinion of the Pope decreased. As they would say in Texas, as somebody says when they don't agree with you, but they know you're doing it for a good reason, they say, oh, bless your heart. So there's a lot of blessing his heart after the encyclical came out. So what does this show? What was the guiding value for people? The guiding value was not what the Pope said. The guiding value was their pre-existing opinion, which, was it informed by the Pope? No. Was it informed by the Bible? No. What was their pre-existing opinion formed by? In the United States, the #1 predictor of whether we agree with the science is simply where we fall on the political spectrum. Now, a converse study that just came out this past October was published by my dad. This is my dad, Doug Hayhoe. He is a science researcher. He does science education. So he and a couple of other researchers, Brian and Mark, they took a video that I had made and they showed it at 3 different Christian colleges. And the really good news is there was a statistically significant difference in the pre versus post tests, and the most conservative college changed the most. So all 3 colleges, they started at different places, they all moved up to the same level. But what they found when they reran the experiment, taking the Christian content out, is they got the same gains. So it wasn't whether the lecture had Christian content or not. It was that the lecture was given to them in the context of the college they attended, which was part of their culture, part of their tribe, part of their trusted source. That was the more important factor. Interesting, isn't it? So, another social scientist called John Evans has looked at this and he said, we know that compared to the not actively religious, conservative, and actually it's Catholic and Protestant, conservative Catholics and Protestants are less likely to agree with the conclusiveness of climate science. But when you control for demographics, that's not where they go to church that really matters. It is, again, our age, our conservatism, and where we fall on the political spectrum. The National Association of Evangelicals has published a report talking about the impact of climate change on the poor. And their government relations director, I think, said the most insightful thing. He said most evangelicals, and I would just put most conservatives there, I put many people, we oppose action to slow climate change not on a religious basis, but politically because we believe the government wants to take away our freedom. Is there really a conflict between the basic tenets of almost every major world religion and the idea that humans are affecting this planet and the people who live on it? Every major world religion has at its core some concept of stewardship, care for creation, as well as the idea of caring for those less fortunate than us. As they say in the Texas translation of the Bible, which they publish on road signs, that love thy neighbor thing, I meant it, sign God. Pretty clear. So don't fall for the smoke screens. What are the smoke screens? The smoke screens are that there are legitimate scientific arguments, and the smoke screens are that there's legitimate religious objections. Well, so if those are not the real ones, and don't get me wrong, these are the first things people come out with, sciencey and religiously sounding objections. But if you have a conversation for more than a single tweet or more than 30 seconds in real life, and I have had thousands of these conversations, it is very rare to find a conversation that does not begin with, it's the sun, that does not take an abrupt right turn, and sometimes the next breath to, the EPA won't let me run my truck. So step number 2 is we need to confront the real problems. And what are the real problems? The real problems start with the fact that we believe that who we are is either fundamentally compatible with or incompatible with agreeing with the number that the thermometer tells us. We have absorbed these shapes into our identity to such an extent that this is the governing force in determining how we look at and understand and agree with information and data and facts. But there's a rationale to it. Because, and actually let me just show you some data. This is data just before the last federal election. Is climate change mostly human, mostly natural, or not happening? You can see the huge divide here. But the interesting thing is, when they talk to people who don't think it's happening, they often have better reasons to explain why they don't think it's happening than people who do. Yes, people who do think it's happening, how do you know it's happening? They're like, oh, I don't know. So it isn't a case of knowing more about it. It's a case of following your political identity. And there's reason for this, because what are we told are the solutions to climate change? We are told the solutions are to destroy the economy. We are told the solutions are to return to the Stone Age, and we are told the solutions are profoundly un-American. What was the Revolutionary War fought over? Unfair taxation, government control. What do people talk about when we're talking about climate solutions? Often the same thing. And then, of course, there's the people who think it's, the Antichrist, the United Nations, and the mark of the beast. This is serious. I get this stuff. It's real. So one of the most dangerous myths that we really have bought into is the myth that you have to be a certain type of person to care about this, and I'm not that type of person. Now, this is not just a US phenomena. If you go to England, to Canada, to Norway, Carrie Norgard wrote a really interesting book about Norway, about Norwegians, very conscious of the reality of climate change. They live up north, they can see climate changing, they agree the science is real. But we feel to support the solutions, we have to be a certain type of person. Like what? Environmentalist, tree hugger, the type of person who, if you're driving down the road in your 100% electric vehicle, and you saw a baby seal and a baby human on the road, you would rather swerve to avoid the seal. I mean, that's kind of the stereotype that we have. The answer, of course, is that you avoid both of them, right? Yes. But it goes even deeper than that, because let's be honest. How did I get here? I got here on an airplane. It was powered by fossil fuels. There are biofuel innovations in the aircraft industry that are very exciting. United Airlines is even running some flights out of LA on biofuel, but it hasn't, penetrated the whole market yet. And so I got here by burning fossil fuels. I live in Texas, my family's in Canada. I want to go home to visit them. I have two choices. I could get an all-electric car and I could spend 35 hours of driving plus an extra 10 hours to charge that car in between to go see them every single time. So that's a 90-hour round trip. Or I could fly in 5 hours. So if we think about it, and be honest again, this is anonymous, if we think about it, we often are afraid of some of the solutions, aren't we? So I want to ask you, here we go, when it comes to climate solutions, what are you most concerned about? Are you worried that it would lead to overregulation? You're only allowed to pick one, okay? Just one. I know you might like to pick a few. Losing your personal freedom to make choices? Reducing your quality of life? My answer is C, full disclosure. The economy taking a hit, job loss for people I know, being on the same side as Al Gore. I'm glad you're being honest about this because I have definitely heard this too. I've actually had people say to me, I would agree with you, but I can't because that would mean I have to agree with Al Gore. So I'm wondering if maybe one day Al Gore might consider changing his mind. I wonder what impact that would have. So there we go. Thank you for being honest. We do have fears. And when these fears are deliberately exploited and blown up and exaggerated and we're told false information about solutions, well, no wonder we're afraid of the solutions and no wonder we don't think we're that type of person. So that's one of the things we believe. And what's the second one? Well, we often fixate, again, on do you agree with the science? And these are results from the Yale Climate Opinion Maps. This is from 2018, showing results by county. People who say, do you think global warming is mostly caused by human activities? Of course, actually, you know what my answer to this is? My answer is no. Why? Because it isn't mostly caused by human activities. We should be getting cooler. It's all caused by human activities, and then some. I know that sounds a bit weird, but think about it. Anyways, anything blue is less than 50%. Anything that's orange is more than 50%. And the darker the color, the further it is in each direction. And we often fixate on do people agree with the science? But as we've just seen, it isn't a matter of facts or education, is it? Now, I'm going to zoom in here so you can actually see Indiana. Here's Indiana. There's Tippecanoe County. I'm really sorry, but you're a little bit behind Monroe County. And I'm gonna confess there was a tiny bit of gloating last night about that. But take heart, because this is really not the important statistic. When you ask people, do you think global warming is happening? Look at the numbers. There is one county in Utah, there is one in West Virginia, and there is one on the Georgia border, and I think that's it. I mean, this is pretty dark orange, isn't it? Now, then you say, do you think global warming will harm plants and animals? Even the people who don't think it's happening think it will harm plants and animals. There is not a single un-Orange County there. Do you think global warming will harm future generations? Yes. Do you think global warming will harm people in developing countries? A little lighter, but still much darker than do you agree with the science, right? Do you think global warming will harm people in the United States? And here's the kicker. Do you think global warming will harm you personally? This is the problem. We fixate on this being the problem. That is not the problem. This is the problem. And why is this the problem? You know the answer. What is the #1 image that people associate with global warming? Now, there might be a few of them. I'm willing to bet most of you will get one thing. What is the #1 image that people associate with global warming? Okay, yes. Polar bears. Exactly. Now there's more. Yeah, okay, man, bear, pig. All right. Fair enough. I love these answers. This is so fun. And actually, somebody got the real one. Where did I see it there? Polar bear looking sad, sitting on a piece of melting ice. Now, I'm Canadian. I was speaking up in Canada last October, and for a room full of scientists, I said, as Canadians, how many of us have seen a polar bear with our own eyeballs in the wild in real life? 4 of us put up our hands. And then I went to Norway in December, and I asked the same question of a group of Norwegian scientists at the University of Oslo. 2 people put up their hands, and then 2 more put up their hands to chastise me for perpetuating stereotypes. They said, everybody comes here expecting to see polar bears. Polar bears don't live in South Norway. Why would you say that? 2 of them even wrote me afterwards. And I was like, I know I'm Canadian. People think polar bears run through the streets of Toronto. I know that. My point was that even people that you think see polar bears on a daily basis do not see polar bears. So if the #1 symbol is an animal that we never see in real life, or if we do see pictures of people, there are people who live far away in places we've never visited, South Sea Islands in the Pacific. The other most dangerous myth we've bought into is that climate change doesn't matter to us. It matters to plants and animals. It matters to future generations. It matters to developing countries. It does not matter to me. Now, this is starting to change, not because of any outreach we've done. It is starting to change because the chickens are coming home to roost. We are seeing not more frequent hurricanes, but we are seeing much more rainfall associated with a given hurricane. It's estimated that 38% of the rain that fell during Harvey would not have occurred if the same storm had happened 100 years ago, because warmer air holds more water vapor and warmer oceans fuel stronger storms. The Thomas wildfire broke the record for the greatest area burned in California last December. Well, that record was broken again less than a year later, and it was smashed by the Camp wildfire. And then, of course, just this past 2 weeks, record flooding across the Midwest. Flooding is normal and natural, but it's being supercharged in a warmer atmosphere. So when the Prime Minister of Dominica, which was one of the islands that was wiped out in the 2017 hurricane season, when he spoke to the United Nations that fall, he said, to deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have just lived. And we're starting to see the data shift. The Yale Climate Opinion Maps, they redo their national polls a couple of times a year, and in January, the latest poll came out, they found the biggest jump in levels of concern they had ever seen. And when they asked me why, I said, well, I do think that one of the reasons is because we're seeing it with our own eyes in the places where we live. But we still have a ways to go. Larry Hamilton sent me this data today. In fact, he sent it to me about 2 hours ago, so I put it in. He said, I've been looking in New Hampshire at, are our winters warming? Well, this is by decade. This is showing warming by decade. Are New Hampshire winters warming by decade according to that data? The answer is yes. That's cold, blue. That's warm, red. just to be clear, the winters are warming. So then he said, do you think the past 20 years are warmer than average? And then he divided answers out by age. It's pretty, pretty even, not much difference by age. Then he divided answers out by gender. Pretty even by gender. Women have a slight edge. Then he divided people's answers out by level of education. Slight edge on post-grad, but overall pretty average. Then he divided answers out by what? Political affiliation. Huge difference. The p-value, for those of you who look at those things, the p-value there is 0.00. Yes. And in fact, when I commented on this, Larry followed up and he said, you know what? Now, he hasn't published these results yet. These results were just published this past year. He said, I also find the same difference in are our roads and bridges in good repair? Why? Because fixing them requires tax dollars. And so political affiliation actually determines whether we think our roads and bridges are in good repair too. Isn't that interesting? So it's not just climate change. So, where were we here? Let me ask you, as we think about experiencing the impacts, and please use the dash here to join your words again, use the dash. As we think about the impacts, what do you see here? Not the polar bears, not people in the South Pacific or the Maldives or Tuvalu or Kiribati. What do you see here in Indiana that you're being affected? Monkeys, really? That's interesting. We'll have to talk more about that one. The other ones, though, I can see where you're coming in. So what's the biggest one? We got flooding, but we've also got drought, right? Flooding and drought. Agriculture, rainfall intensity, taxes going to disasters, dunes because they're awesome. I like that one, I agree. I lived in northern Indiana for 6 years, and I love those dunes. Soil health, people, extremes, farming, warmer summers. Somebody's been listening to a little too much Weezer. We know that climate change is affecting us in the places where we live. So here's the last step. What's the first step? The first step is don't fall for the smoke screens. Don't be Don Quixote tilting at windmills. The second step is recognizing the real problems, that people don't think there are solutions that are consistent with their values, and we don't think the impacts matter. So our threat-o-meter is totally out of whack. We think that the impacts are going to be fine, but the solutions are going to be terrible. And what we have to recognize and what we have to look for is the fact that the impacts are already terrible and they're getting worse, but there are positive solutions that can be compatible with our values. So, what does the way forward look like? Well, we already looked at this one, right? This was the dark blue map. How many people think that climate change will affect them personally? And just as an aside, look at the orange counties. You now know the answer to this. Who lives in those orange counties? The most concerned people group, which are Hispanic Catholics. Yeah, isn't that interesting? See it show up. And this was a totally different survey, done in a totally different year. Now, let me show you a couple of maps. We have not looked at the orangest maps. What do you think the orangest maps are of? Now, so far, the orangest map we've had is global warming real, right? Or is it happening? That was the orangest. Well, I have a very orange map for you. Do you support the government funding research into renewable energy? 80 to 95% across the entire country. Do not ask me what is up with Dallas, because Dallas is 100% clean energy already, and so that strikes me as a bit weird. Do you support tax rebates for people who purchase energy-efficient vehicles or solar panels? And now this is a kicker. Do you support taxing is the dirty three-letter word, do you support taxing fossil fuel companies while equally reducing other taxes so people don't suffer? Look at this. It's more orange than do you think this thing is real and happening because of humans? So do I care? And then also, if you can also ask, do you support reducing carbon dioxide as a pollutant? If they support action on climate change, but they don't agree that climate is changing due to human activities, I don't care. I really don't care, because it doesn't matter. What matters is what we do, not why we do it. So if we're really that positive about the solutions, and we're really that negative about thinking it affects us personally, the most important thing we can do is something that you might not expect. People often say, well, what can I do? I am a student. I live in rented housing. I can't even change my light bulbs. What can I do? I can't afford solar panels or a Tesla. What can I do? I don't own any land. What can I do? I'm not a producer. I'm not a farmer. Well, interestingly, this is not the bluest map. There's one more darker blue map, and you know what that darker blue map is? The darker blue map is, do you ever talk about it? Nobody talks about it. Well, a few people who live up in the mountains in Colorado seem to maybe talk about it. But other than that, we don't talk about it. Why don't we talk about it? Because we are afraid it might end like this, or we're afraid it might end like this. So when TED came, and I don't mean TED a person, I mean this TED. When TED came to me last year and they said, what do you want to do a TED Talk on? I said, I want to do it on the most important thing each one of us can do, and that is talk about this. And then a lot of people say, well, talk about it? What are you talking about? That is way past. We have to act. But here's the point. If we don't talk about it, why would we care? And we've already seen people don't care. They don't think it affects us. If we don't talk about it, why would we care? If we don't care, why would we ever do anything about it? A conversation is something that everybody can do. You can do it with your fingers. You can use your mouth. You can talk to people you know. You can talk to people you don't know. The most important thing we can do is talk about it, because by talking about it, we can correct that threadometer. We can talk about how the impacts really do matter, and there are viable solutions. So let me ask you this. Who would you like to have a conversation with? If you could have a constructive conversation, a positive conversation with somebody, okay, I support you having that conversation. I think that would be great. My family, brothers, grandparents, Americans, I like that. The state senators, politicians, congresspeople, priests, Inhofe, yep. Co-workers. Not sure who Ralph is, but sure, Ralph, yep. Obama, China. I've had a conversation with Obama about climate change. And it was really interesting. Look at this, I love this, it's filling up. It was really interesting because they wanted to arrange the questions ahead of time. So Leonardo DiCaprio was asking the questions, and then Obama and I were supposed to be answering the questions. So they went over the questions very carefully, and Leonardo actually drafted the first set. So I get this set from his publicist, not from him, don't get excited, I got it from the publicist. And it was really interesting because the questions were super technical, like please list the primary sources of methane, in order, with estimated teragrams. So I was like, no, we got to be a bit more general. I'm not sure people really care about the methane budget that acutely. So we carefully arranged these questions, and then we get up there on stage, and my main concern was that I not trip and fall flat on my face on the way to the stage. As long as I get there okay, I'm fine. So I sat down, didn't trip, everything was good. So I was relaxed answering the questions. So he asked me a question, then he asked Obama a question. And Obama answers 8 questions without stopping to breathe. And then you could just see Leonardo looking at the questions like, he's like, and then he asked him another question, and the man just goes. His level of knowledge was absolutely astounding. It was insane. This is great. Look at all these lists. I love this. Okay. I will not ask some questions about some of those. Yeah, you know who you are. So how to have this conversation. I'm going to give you a template. Ready? Here we go. 3 steps. Step number 1, begin the conversation with something that you agree with the person on. If you don't know what that might be, talk about something else. Get to know them a little bit better. Figure out something that you agree on. If you cannot find something you agree on, you are not the right person to have a conversation with them about climate change. Don't have it. Move on. Find something that you both agree on, and then after you've found that, which could be as simple as we both live in the same place, or we're really worried about Midwest flooding, then you can explain why we would care about a changing climate because of what we both agree on. But then step number 3 is super important. Do not leave people talking about a problem without a solution. I mean, if you talk about a problem without a solution, then you're like, okay, fine, what am I supposed to do? You have to talk about solutions, and that's not what we climate scientists do. We climate scientists diagnose stuff. We diagnose the heck out of this problem. We can tell you exactly how bad it is, but we don't fix it. So I've had to educate myself on what solutions look like so I can share them with people. So let me give you some concrete examples of each one of these steps, okay? Because beyond this, there is no magic formula for everybody. It depends on who you are and who you're talking to. So what values do we share? Do we love the place that we live? Do we enjoy local food? Are we birders? Do we enjoy going to the coast? Are we concerned about the future of agribusiness? Do we care about our waters? Do we care about our families? In my TED Talk, I talk about the first time I was invited to speak to a Rotary Club in West Texas. I'm not a Rotarian, but I walk in and they were considerate enough to print their values on a giant 4-foot poster that stared me in the face when I walked in. And I looked at this and I thought, this is climate change. Is it the truth? Yes. Is it fair to all concerned? Absolutely not. That's why I care so much about it, because the people who contributed least to the problem are the people who are being most affected. Would it build goodwill and better friendships to do something about it? Yes, I think it would. And would it be beneficial to all? Well, if we fix it, yes. If we don't, no. So I skipped the buffet. I rearranged my talk super fast into the 4-way test on climate change. And at the beginning, you could see everybody was kind of sitting here like this. And they were giving the woman who invited me some pretty interesting looks. Like, we know that you invited her. But then I started to go through the 4-way test, and the body language changed a bit. They're like, oh. And then there was nodding. And then when I got to the end, I will never forget, a local bank owner who I had met before came up to me at the end with the most bemused look on his face. And he said, you know, I was never really too sure about this whole global warming thing, but it passed the 4-way test. Like, despite his will, he had to agree because this was his value system, and climate change passed his value system. For many of us, our values come from our faith, and that's why connecting on our faith is such an important place to begin our conversation. Because the closer that value is to our hearts, talking about our kids, our family, the place where we're from, our faith, the closer that value is to our hearts, the more solid and direct the connection to why we would care. So then, we can connect the dots. We can talk about how we know it's real and it's us, and yes, scientists really do agree. But more importantly, we can talk about why it matters. Rising sea level and stronger coastal storms along the east, greater area burned by wildfires and invasive species moving northward, eating millions of acres of forest. What used to be permanently frozen ground in the north, thawing and crumbling, putting towns and villages and infrastructure and even oil pipelines at risk. Where we live in Indiana, looking at our outdoor recreation and tourism, looking at the health and vitality of our city, looking at the success of our economy based on agriculture, looking at flood risk. Where can you find this information? Well, the second volume of the National Climate Assessment, which was just released this past November, the so-called Black Friday report, it is online at NCA2018.globalchange.gov, and it has chapters for every region and every sector. So it has an ag chapter, it has a water chapter, and of course it has a Midwest chapter. And it talks specifically about things that matter to us here. One of the key messages is about agriculture. It talks about how increases in warm season humidity and precipitation have eroded soils, creating favorable conditions for pests and pathogens, degrading the quality of stored grain. It talks about transportation and infrastructure, how elevated flood risk and changing rainfall patterns are putting our stormwater management systems, our transportation, and other critical infrastructure at risk. It even puts dollar signs on how much it's going to cost just to adapt storm sewer systems alone to the increase in heavy precipitation. And then, of course, right here in Indiana, you have your own assessment. The Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment is putting each of these issues into context. There's chapters on health, forest ecosystems, urban green spaces, agriculture, aquatic ecosystems, tourism, recreation, energy, and few more chapters to come. So if you're looking for information on how climate change is affecting people in Indiana, you can find it in spades. But we have to talk about how to fix this thing too. Like what? Well, we can absolutely talk about what we're doing ourselves. We could have great conversations about, man, it was really hard for me to replace those funky vintage light bulbs, but I found some good ones, and they work great, and look how much my power bill went down. This is real. I actually did. We don't have curbside recycling, but our university does have single-stream recycling. It's open 24/7. Anybody in the city can drop off their recycling in a single bag, and they use the proceeds of the recycling to fund 35 student scholarships. So who wouldn't love to give their garbage to the university to fund student scholarships? It's pretty cool. Eating local is a great way to invest in the local economy. I even have some students who are growers at the local market, and reduce our carbon footprint at the same time. And eating lower down the food chain is a great way to improve our health, reduce our food budget, and reduce our carbon footprint also. I have a plug-in. It also has a gas tank because I live in Texas. And we live on a cul-de-sac where all our neighbors drive these big giant Yukons and GMCs. And it's Texas, so everybody has the air conditioning cranked. And so when they drive by you and you're outside, they wave out the window. Don't roll down the window, just wave. So the first 2 weeks I got my car, I had it plugged in outside. Now this is actually not my actual car. You can see by the license plate it's not a Texas car, but this is exactly what my car looks like. So the first 2 weeks I had it plugged in outside the house. And if we were outside, every single neighbor stopped their car, got out of the car, walked around and said, "What is that?" You say, "Well, it's a plug-in car." "Does it have a gas pedal? What about a steering wheel? Can I sit in it? Where'd you buy it? How much did it cost? How much are you saving on gas? That much? Wow, that's really nice." And then the next time I saw them, they would roll down the window, or really roll down the window, and they'd be like, "I love your car." So we had great conversations about that. And then we just got some solar panels, which, thanks to the super low prices and the government rebate, we're actually going to pay off in 5 years, which is pretty decent. And this is a great way to have conversations. And I already have tons of people saying, "Where'd you get them? How do I get them?" And even the local utilities like, "Wow, all of a sudden we've got like 200 solar installations this year, and last year we had 2. Not because of us. I mean, it's just happening all over. We can talk about what our communities are doing, what big universities are doing, what little universities are doing. We can talk about how people are looking at using solar farms to plant pollinator-friendly plants to maintain butterfly and insect populations. We can look at what churches are doing. The cross shape is a bonus. We can look at what the richest company in the world is doing. Now, Walmart certainly has some hiccups along the way. They're very ambitious, but they don't always stop to figure out how they're going to do it when they announce it. But they're at least trying to reduce their carbon footprint, to reduce the carbon in their supply chain. Apple's already done it 100% in their own operations, and they're working on decarbonizing their own supply chain too. And by the way, this is the richest corporation in the world, and this is the 11th richest corporation in the world. They're not exactly hurting economically. I like talking about what Texas is doing because it's very unexpected, isn't it? You probably didn't expect me to stand up here and talk about what Texas is doing. Texas has the biggest military base in the US, Fort Hood, and 2 years ago, they went with wind and solar energy over natural gas for one reason. They'd save over $150 million of taxpayer money because it was cheaper. DFW is the first carbon neutral airport in the world. DFW, Dallas-Fort Worth. Now, of course, they didn't decarbonize the airplanes too. They don't own them. But operations at the airport are, and that's a good first step. They have entire towns, like Georgetown, that are 100% clean energy. The city of Dallas, its own city operations are 100%. And every year we break new records. So far, we're up to 19.2% wind and solar energy on the Texas grid. 2 years ago, it was 12%. What about Indiana? Well, Indiana's got stuff going on too, right? Northern Indiana Power Utility announcing they're going to save customers $4 billion by phasing out coal plants faster than they thought and replacing them by renewables. Indiana leads the Midwest in the growth of rural green jobs. Who doesn't like that? And then we can talk about what the world is doing, how Morocco has the biggest solar farm in the world, and the United Kingdom has the biggest offshore wind farm in the world, and how China has more wind and solar energy than any other country in the world. Now, if you're having a conversation with, that hard-nosed relative, you can be like, "Are you okay with the fact that China is beating the pants off us when it comes to new clean energy? Are you not aware that the economy runs on energy and that China is building massive resources that are putting us to shame? Are you okay with that? Because I'm not okay with that." You can have a good conversation there. But I love talking about what's happening in places where people don't have energy, where they have no access to electricity, where all they have is possibly kerosene, where they're being empowered because they don't have coal deposits. They don't have oil or gas deposits, or if they do, they're run by very corrupt governments and all the funds go out of the country. I love talking about how pay-as-you-go solar is revolutionizing areas in sub-Saharan Africa where they don't have transmission grids, they don't have power grids, they don't have big power plants, but they do have a lot of sun. Project Drawdown is someplace that I go for hope. It's called drawdown.org. It's a book and a website, and they've listed 100 solutions to climate change, some of which are very unexpected. The idea that you can burn agricultural residue at super high temperature and then plow it back into the soil like indigenous people have been doing in the Amazon for hundreds of years. This is not exactly newfangled technology. And for average to poor soil, it is like Miracle Grow on steroids. In fact, a colleague at Iowa State University, he took the biochar they made and he took 2 pots of tomatoes and he put biochar in one and nothing in the other. And then he took a picture of the tomatoes in July and there was like 3 times more tomatoes. Clean cook stoves so people don't have to cut down wood. Indoor air pollution from burning fuel inside kills millions of people every year. I love that number 6 on their list is educating women and girls. Isn't that cool? Because the more educated a woman is, the lower the infant mortality rate, the healthier her family, the more she can provide for her family, the better off they are, and it turns out the lower the carbon footprint too. And then number three is reducing food waste. We throw out 1/3 of the food we eat. Or sorry, no, we throw out 1/3 of the food we make. We don't eat it. Don't quote me on that one. That's a bit weird. Reducing food waste helps with hunger. It helps with the grocery bill. And so what I've started to do is there's a grocery store on my way home from school. And so I've started to stop 2 or 3 times a week instead of once every 2 weeks like I used to for a massive shop, which led to a lot of food waste. My fridge is also kind of empty too, which is nice. The bottom line is to fix this thing, we need hope. Fear is only going to take us so far. Panic is only going to motivate short-term action. To really fix this thing, we need hope. And so here is my last question to you. Ready? Full sentences are fine here. You tell me what gives you hope. Because where do I find hope? I find hope from the stories I hear from people. You have to go out and look for hope. It's not going to come finding you. You have to go out and look for hopeful information, hopeful stories, often for stories about what individual people are going to do. I'm sorry I lied about the whole sentence there. Apologize. It is words. I love that. Children, education, faith. Yep, that's where a lot of my hope comes from too. People, friends. Elon Musk, yep. When he has enough sleep. I love that. Look at that. What's here? What gives us hope? It's people, kindness, faith, kids, young people, science. Science really is good. Hippie food. Yep, okay. We need hope. That's great. So how can we have that conversation with that person whose name you entered? By bonding over shared values, figure out what you genuinely agree with them on. And if you can't, don't have the conversation. Explain why it matters. And last of all, find ways that we can work together to act. So in conclusion, how do we talk about science in a fact-free world? Well, it turns out that Jane Goodall has the answer. I grew up watching movies of Jane Goodall when I was a little girl, and just a couple of years ago, after a long career, decades in science, she said something which I think perfectly sums this up. She said, "It is only when our clever brain and our human heart work together in harmony that we can achieve our full potential." So to fix this thing, we have our clever brains, we have our facts and our data and our science. We need to connect them to our heart. That's how we're going to fix it. Thank you. Thank you so much. If you want more, our Global Weirding series is about 35 super short videos that answers a lot of the questions we talked about tonight, including what does the Bible say about climate change and how do you know it's not a natural cycle? And then you can also connect on social media, on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. But what we're going to do is, if you need to leave, now's the time for you to leave. If you want to stay for a little bit, we're going to do about 10 minutes of questions. You can ask questions 2 ways. Number 1, and I really am serious this time, you can type in a full sentence here, and it will appear here. Or you can come to the mic, and we'll alternate between live questions, a mic on each side, and questions that appear up here. So if people are listening in the live stream, they can type their question in here too, and that way people listening remotely can engage with the questions as well. But if you're going to leave, now's the time to leave. If you're not going to leave, stay put for the next 10 minutes, all right? If you want to ask a question, come ahead to the front. There's a microphone on each side, and we've got a couple of questions here. It's good. All right, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you for coming to Indiana. Awesome. I'm here because my friend Dory Chandler talked about it on Facebook over and over and over. And I wouldn't have really been here if it wasn't for her. And so that's an example of talking about it.
Thank you.
So thank you, Dory, and thank you for coming.
That's awesome. You pretty much had 2 choices. You had a choice to like either strangle her or come to the event, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so you came. Well, there you go. So talking about it brought you.
My question for you is, I'm a sales professional, and my goal this year is to help anyone selling the AD drawdown solutions, help them sell $50 million more than they would have without me. So my question for you is, do you know anybody in the sales world who is also on this wavelength, who wants to help sell these AD solutions?
That's a good question. I feel like I do know a lot of people, and your question actually relates to a much bigger issue, which is people often feel like, well, I'm not a scientist. What am I supposed to do? We need everybody. We need salespeople because you have a skill set that I do not have. And we need to help people understand why a product is good, why they want to be doing a certain thing or not doing a different thing. So I think I would have to look through my LinkedIn contacts to get any specific names. But the answer is we need your exact skill set. We need people who create art. We need people who are experts at communication. We need people who can write. We need people who are willing to enter politics. We need people who are willing to keep on doing exactly what they're already doing, but factor climate change into their everyday life. All right, we have a ton of good questions here. Okay. What is the 0 that annual average temperature change is based on? The 0 is a 30-year average, which for the figure I showed is the 1961 to 1990 average. But if you just add that back in, you're going to see that global temperature has increased from about 57 to just over about 58.5 degrees, so in real temperature. How do we talk? Am I supposed to have a question? No, you are not supposed to have a question. How do we talk about solutions when they're proposed by people we don't agree with? This is actually a great opportunity, and this relates to a question about the Green New Deal, yes or no. There's a lot of discussion and debate over the Green New Deal, which I think is great because what are we doing? We're talking, right? And just because you think we need to fix climate change, do you have to agree with the Green New Deal? No, you don't. But if you don't, then you need to talk about, well, if I don't agree with it, then what do I agree with? What would I propose as a countermeasure to that? And what I like to do, I don't want to be policy prescriptive as a scientist because the atmosphere doesn't care how we reduce the carbon, it just wants us to do it as soon as possible. I like to share with people how there are libertarian organizations that have libertarian solutions to climate change. The Niskanen Institute is one. There are free market institutes like Republic N, not N, but EN, that have free market solutions to climate change. There are bipartisan solutions, like there is a bill before Congress right now that was introduced in November called the Energy Innovation Act that looks at putting a price on carbon and refunding the revenues to people. There are policy prescriptive solutions. There are socialist solutions. There are solutions across the entire spectrum, and if we don't like a given solution, we need to be saying, okay, well, I don't like that, but instead, let's figure out what we do like. And so it's a great opportunity to have a conversation. All right, next.
Hi, I'm Ari. I'm also here with Dory in that group.
Great.
Nice little group from India. Okay, so recently I was in sort of an argument with somebody on Facebook about clean energy and whether or not wind and solar can really work as the baseline for energy in the future. This person I was in an argument with suggested that nuclear would be better because it takes up less space and it's completely clean. She argued, you know, wind and solar, you can't use it at night or when the wind isn't blowing, and you can't store it, and you know, at a certain percent of efficiency, you can't charge batteries and use it at the same time. I'm just wondering what sort of counter arguments you would make, and where online or anywhere you could find more information to directly counter this later. I tried to explain there is new technology that was announced by the Obama administration shortly before he left office in 2016 regarding battery technology or battery storage. So
that's something I hear a lot. So what that's based on is it's based on a grain of truth, right? Because obviously if the sun is not shining, it will not generate power. We all know that, right? It's amazing that people always have to remind us of that, as if somehow we thought that wasn't true. But it's based on a grain of truth, but it's based on old information that was true 5 or 10 years ago that isn't true today, but is old information that is actively propagated. So the Washington Post asked me to write an article in December called 5 Myths We Believe About Climate Change. So I wrote this article about 5 myths we believe and the answers to them. And then when I went to their page to read the article, because they said it was posted, you know what the ad banner said? The ad banner said, buy this book that shows how wind energy is unreliable and expensive and will never supply our power. That was what the ad banner said, and I was like, dang, myth number 6. Because the truth is, and Clean Technica is a good website that I go to for the latest advances. They update renewable energy and battery storage information very regularly, Clean Technica. The reality is that we already have functioning, operating solar farms that have storage built into them through heated oil or heated salts, where they heat up during the day and they give off heat at night to run the turbines. They're already functional. Battery storage and storage in general, whether it's pumping water underground under pressure and letting it back up to turn the turbine, pumping water uphill and letting it run back down to turn the turbine, or batteries, storage costs are falling, but that is the biggest place where costs have to fall more to really provide the backbone of the grid. But to say that storage will never be capable of that is foolish. Just look at the trajectory of the costs and look at the size of the storage, and we know that we'll get there. It isn't going to happen today, but we're on our way there. But at the same time, I would diffuse what people say a little bit, because I've noticed people are often very pro-nuclear, and so they say, well, you must be anti-nuclear, right? And I say, no, I'm actually okay with any energy source that can be done affordably. Why don't you look into the cost of building the most recent nuclear plant in the United States? Yeah, astronomical. I'm in favor of anything that can be done affordably, that can be located safely, not in a geologically active zone, or right beside the ocean where they could have a tsunami, and something that's competitive. And so, for example, at Idaho National Labs, they were developing this mini nuclear, where it's modular, and a single module fits on the back of a semi. And so you could put together modular nuclear, where you put together 4 modules for a small town, and that's it. If you could do it at cost, and if you could figure out what to do with the waste, and if solar or wind or tidal or geothermal is not viable for you, well, at least it does cut carbon. And so that kind of diffuses a bit of the argument when you say, you know what, there is this great technology, but unfortunately a lot of that research got canceled by this administration. Are you okay with that? That leads to another good conversation. So we do have to make sure we get our facts, though, and Clean Technica is one of the websites that I use when I look for that information. Okay, let me take one of these quick here and then go to you. So, oh, excellent. Somebody asked me a question about one of my friends and colleagues, Virginia Burkett. Virginia is a friend of mine, and I can't speak personally to George Bush, but what I can say is I have had many conversations with elected officials at the city, state, and federal level, and I have heard from quite a few of them, either firsthand or secondhand, that they're like, sure, climate change is real, but I'm not going to say it is. Because what's the greater threat? The greater threat is getting voted out of office than saying that, than getting voted out for saying it's real. I often imagine, I don't think this is real, but I imagine that there is a room in Congress that has a picture of Bob Inglis on the wall. Bob Inglis is a very conservative, 2-time Republican congressman who, when challenged by his son to look into climate change, decided very honestly, yeah, it is real. So he announced that he thought climate change was real. He lost the primaries. So I feel like there's this room with a picture of Bob and a chair, and they put all the freshman Congress people in their chair, and they say, don't be like Bob. And Bob is still very active, having conversations with his colleagues about this. But there really is an issue where people don't believe there's viable solutions, but you don't want to get up and say it's real, but I don't want to fix it. No politician ever wants to say that. No human wants to say that. Do we want to say, sure, it's real, but I don't want to fix it? No. So what do? We throw up sciencey sounding objections. We throw up religiously sounding objections because they make us a smart person or a devout person or a conservative person. So we throw up the smoke screens when the real problem is we don't want to fix it. All right, question.
Hi, I'm Andrew. I'm here thanks to the Environment Science Club. I'm from Scarborough, and
I'm from Etobicoke.
Etobicoke? Oh,
yeah.
Nice. Very close. So anyways, you know that our bus system, the TDC, you know, it's all hydro-powered, like 100%. But the thing is, we're still like using the very old system where our buses are attached to the tracks and have the ropes attached, and it drives through with the track. And each time it tries to stop, it requires traction, and that requires more energy. Like it takes traction and energy in order to stop the bus each time, and it takes another bunch of energy to move it. What is your take on it? Are you okay with it since it's all like 100% hydro-powered?
Well, it's better to have, so nowadays, modern vehicles have regenerative power, right? So as you brake, the power goes back into the battery. But manufacturing a whole new set of buses and streetcars for the city of Toronto also takes a lot of energy. So at some point, you have to do the cost-benefit analysis of at what point are we going to swap out the technology. And typically, what's best is as it ages out naturally, you replace it with something that, for example, uses braking to recharge a battery.
I see.
That's usually most effective. Because it's rare that just wholesale throwing everything away and getting new stuff is actually better, because manufacturing has a huge carbon footprint. Okay. But I have to say that, and that relates to a different issue, public transportation is a huge issue. And that is an enormous way that we can reduce our carbon footprint if we have that as an option. But where I live now, so I'm from Toronto, I never owned a car, ever. I never had one. And then I moved to Texas, and we had to get a car because we don't even have a bus route that goes out to where I live. So unfortunately, in addition to people who don't think climate change is real, there's a lot of people who feel like, I know how everybody should be living their lives, and if you're not living your life the way I say so, you are evil and terrible, and you are the problem. So there was one woman actually who decided that I should be taking the train to work. And I said, well, there is no train. And she says, I Googled it. There's a train called the DART in Texas. I'm like, that's in Dallas, 6 hours away. And she's like, I hate you. And I blocked her. So it's a really interesting issue. And that's why we talked earlier about sales. We need people who do urban planning. We need engineers. We need people who do sustainable development. We need people who do green buildings. We need health professionals. We need everybody to integrate this into every aspect. We don't want the climate change person. We want this to be something that we're all conscious of no matter who we are and where we are. So, thank you.
Actually, it's still related. Like, so you know how Toronto House has put in more bicycles for rent, but then the bicycles are like, how to say, they're not exactly recyclable ones. Is that still a concern, or do you think do you think the weight benefit is still better?
At this point, I would say climate change is the more urgent issue. It really is.
And so having people using transportation through bicycles is the better option, you would say? If
possible, yes.
Right. I would. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, so let me just whip through a couple of these, then we will take 2 more questions here. Actually, well, we've got 3 people. Okay, we'll do a cutoff here. Are you going to ask a question too? Okay, all right, we'll do it quick. So think of how to phrase your question very briefly. Ready? Now, let me get through a couple of these. What about people who love cars? My husband loves cars. He test drove a Tesla. He fell in love with the Tesla because the acceleration on those things is just like crazy compared to anything else. So it doesn't mean that we don't have to. Now, technology isn't going to solve everything. That is not the answer to everything. But at the same time, going back to the Stone Ages is not the answer either. Geoengineering, we have a global weirding episode on it. And it starts with the chemtrail conspiracy theory myth. So go watch the global weirding episode on geoengineering, and you will really enjoy it. There's a lot of chemtrail conspiracy theorists out in West Texas, because the sky is very big. You can spend a lot of time watching the sky. Let's see. Where do I see the world in 10 years? That's really what we're lacking, is a better vision of the future. We see all these apocalyptic visions of the future from climate scientists. We see apocalyptic visions of the future from people who say the solutions are going to destroy us. Where's the positive vision of the future that we want to live in? That's what we really need, is a vision of a future that we want. People don't line up for the new iPhone because somebody told them they should get it. They line up for it because they think it's going to be great. Whether it is or not is a matter of opinion. But we want something, and this relates to sales, we want something because we think it's better, not worse. And so I think we're really lacking that vision of a better future. The challenge for talking to people who get donations from fossil fuel industries, it's a really huge challenge. And we cannot underestimate the fact that 8 out of 10 of the richest corporations in the world make their money extracting, processing, selling, or encouraging us to use fossil fuels. So we are talking about a massive shift in the power balance of the world like we have not seen since horses and buggies gave way to cars. And then, let's see, advice for people who are interested. Oh, actually, I'm going to take the second one. It's taking me 5 years to pay off the solar panels. How do you expect people living paycheck to pay for such resources? By getting a loan where the payment every month is $100 less than your average power bill is already. The producer on our Global Weirding series just married, new baby, small house. After we did the first Global Weirding series, he's like, man, I got to do something, but I don't have a lot of money. I can't just afford to buy a set of solar panels and smack them on my roof. So he doesn't have a lot of money, but he can do the research. So he Googled it. He found a company in the Midwest who actually offers the loans. You submit 12 months of power bills. They look at your average per month. They give you a loan for $100 less. It takes you a little bit longer to pay it off in full, but it didn't cost him a cent more. In fact, he's saving $1,200 a year. It's pretty cool. Lots of great questions. The most impactful moment of my career. Was it scientific or human-based? I think it was human-based. I think it was when I realized that we really can have positive conversations about this thing. I think that was probably the most impactful part of my career. And then in terms of government research positions, they still exist. I mean, they go up and down. Things are tough right now. But there's a lot of places where we can go in academia, in government, in state, in nonprofit, even increasingly corporations. Yeah, corporations are starting to hire people to do climate-related research because it directly impacts ag, it directly impacts water, it impacts financial investments, insurance rates. There's a lot of businesses now offering new opportunities, so it's really starting to open up. All right, these are awesome questions, but we're going to turn back to you three here. What are your questions? Go for it.
I really appreciate the discussion. So when we understand science, we can predict. We can predict what's going to happen when we put somebody on the moon, the physics of it. Mm-hmm. One of my frustrations is I look at all the climate models, and a lot of them do overestimate. Now, I guess my question to you is what climate model is the most accurate that we can cite, that we can get to, and we could watch and predict what's going to happen? And if it does predict correctly, we understand. Yeah. If it does not predict correctly, we still do not understand.
Great question, because this is actually what my research does. I evaluate climate models. So I can answer that question, and I can say there is no single one that is most accurate, but the average of multiple models does give us the most accurate information. But you're operating under a bit of a misconception. We're not generating predictions. Predictions are uncertain based only on scientific uncertainty. The greatest uncertainty in the future right now is not scientific. It's human. How we get our energy, how much carbon we produce, that is the biggest uncertainty. And so that's why what we do for the future is not called predictions, they're called projections. Because depending on whether we produce more carbon or less carbon, we are going to see a very different world. We do use those climate models, though, to study Mars, Venus, the ice ages, past climate. And when we do that, we see, and the National Climate Assessment that I showed shows this very clearly, for global temperature, the models are right on. They are not overestimating global temperature change in the last century. For extreme rain events, they're off. They are underestimating the observed trend in extreme rain events. When we look at paleoclimate and we apply climate models to look at paleoclimate in the past, they underestimate the changes that we have actually seen occurring due to natural factors in the past when CO2 was released from the ocean into the atmosphere naturally, causing massive amounts of change. So if you look at the National Climate Assessment, Volume 1, if you look at Chapter 15, it talks very specifically about what we know climate models are or are not doing, and it gets into that in some detail. So that's why we use as many as we can, but we look at multiple future scenarios because our choices are the biggest uncertainty. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much for coming to Purdue and giving us this opportunity to listen to you. My name is Anita, and I have founded a company called Rainmakers Worldwide, And what we do is we find solutions for climate action. And they're all green technology solutions. And they cover various areas, energy, so it's all renewable energy, water, waste, and food. And ours is just a small part of the large spectrum of solutions. I work with hundreds of technology guys who produce these solutions. The question is, why are they not being embraced and accepted like they should be? Because,
yes.
you know, I'm done with talking. I have talked with everybody, with governments, with municipalities, with corporations, you name it. It's falling on deaf ears. So do you have any suggestions for, you know, all these amazing inventors I represent?
Lack of incentive. Why is it not succeeding? It's because whoever you're talking to does not see the benefit for them short term in adopting new technology. Something new for us requires energy. It is easier for us to stay with the old than it is to go with the new.
Yeah.
And so we have to realize that even though the new might look better, there's a significant amount of energy required to actually make that change. There's mental energy. There's physical energy. There's cost. And so somehow you're not connecting on what they would see as the benefits for them.
Even though we give them massive financial benefit, because each one of these technologies produces massive financial returns just from its byproducts, just from running it.
I couldn't say without more details, but the basic problem is it's not getting through.
Right.
The benefits that you are communicating to them are not connecting with the benefit part of their brain. And I'm not sure how to do that better. That's really not my field as a climate scientist. But I can tell you there are people, I think, who could help with that because there is a miscommunication happening if that is the case.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And so actually talking there is probably a very important step, but having a bit of a different conversation, maybe. Okay, last question of the night.
So you had a great Twitter thread on this a couple weeks ago, but I'm just wondering if you kind of go over it again for the audience here. What's up with 1.5 to 2.5 Celsius and the 12-year figure?
Yes, I did have a Twitter thread about that, yes. So we humans, we like round numbers. So when we're talking about climate goals, we need a climate goal. Scientifically, what we can say as scientists is simply this. The more carbon we produce, the greater the change. Is there a magic number of cigarettes that you can smoke without any damages? Well, 0. But I mean, there's not like you can smoke 9,999 cigarettes and you will be 100% okay, but if you smoke one more, you are screwed. That's not the way it works. So in the same way, if we got to 1.99999 degrees Celsius, everything is totally fine, and then we get to 2.0001 degrees Celsius and we're just screwed. That's not the way it works. Climate impacts increase with each additional gigaton of carbon we produce, and the more they increase, the more serious the impact. So where does the 2-degree target come from that the world agreed to in Paris? Where does the 1.5-degree target come to that they said we should really try better for? It comes to the fact that we're quantifying what impacts we expect for a degree, for a degree and a half, for 2 degrees, for 3 degrees, for 4 degrees. And then, not us scientists, but policymakers, people who look at economics and technology and resources and water and agriculture, they look at these scientific results and they say, all right, what is dangerous for us? So for many developed countries, there's kind of a consensus around, well, roughly 1.5 might be okay, but 2 is pretty serious, and beyond 2 is going to be actually pretty impactful on our economy or our health or our resources. For a lot of developing countries, it's a lot lower. Some of them are already at that. We're at 1 degree. Some of them say by 1.5 degrees, it could be catastrophic for their economy, looking at losing, minimum 1/4 of their GDP or more. So where do these thresholds come from? They come from policy making that is informed by science. But the thresholds are not scientific per se, because what we say is the more we produce, the worse it gets. But you need a goal. I mean, if you're going to lose weight, you need a goal, right? You step on the scales, you measure where you are today, and you're like, I want to lose 15 pounds. So in the same way, we need goals to aim for. But just because we hit a goal does not mean everything's A-okay. We are already suffering impacts today. The more temperature rises and the faster it does so, the more impacts we will suffer in the future. So our choices really do matter. And what I want to leave you with as hope is this. It's not too late. Now, yes, some impacts are already here today, and some impacts are already going to happen because of the emissions we've already produced. But I specifically look at future projections, not predictions, and I specifically look at the impact between a high carbon future and a low carbon future. And let me tell you, there is a world of difference between those two futures. We still have the ability to choose which one we want to be on. And that's why it's so important to have that conversation today, to talk about what impacts mean for us here in the places where we live, and to educate ourselves and to share positive solutions that grow the local economy, that help farmers, that make our communities safer and more secure, that reduce air pollution and cut water pollution and grow green jobs and local energy. It's important to have these conversations because we do have a choice. It is not too late to make a difference, but the window of time is closing, and that's why we all must act. Thank you.
Just really want to thank you, Dr. Hayhoe. That was really, I think, stirring, eye-opening, and hopefully we'll step out and really start to try to make a difference. And it all gets back to that relationship, right? Having the conversation, getting on the same page, not talking about things in terms that cause opposition, but finding out what you can talk about in the same theme. So I really like the 1, 2, 3. It's pretty simple. So we really thank you for coming. It was really awesome. Thank you to the 2017-2018 ESE Cohort Symposium team for putting this on.
Yeah.
So Liz Allman and Patricia Neese and Jake Hawes, I don't know where he is. I can't see without my glasses. And even Becca Nixon in Pakistan. So hopefully she could see some. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. That was awesome.
Really awesome.